everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar on incorporating tree testing into your content design. Just start off with a little bit of an introduction. My name is Leah Catania, and I'm the Senior Content Strategist for User Guides at Insulet. I have spent my career working in the pharmaceutical supply chain and medical device industries, doing technical writing, UX writing, content strategy, information architecture, and various types of usability testing and UX research. So today we're going to dive into the basics about usability testing your content, information architecture, tree testing. Then we're going to kind of get into more specifics about how to actually run a tree test, what you should set up, the tools you can use, how to run your sessions and analyze the results. And then finally, we'll look at an example of a tree test that I helped run and some of the details and examples that we can pull out of that. So first, the basics, just want to make sure that everyone is on the same page. For usability testing your content, it can seem really daunting at first. There's not usually specific tasks that users are actually going to be doing inside of your content. But with really any type of content, there are usually a few key questions that you really should know how to answer. Can people actually find the content that they're looking for? Can people understand the content once they found it? And can people perform tasks following your instructions? And one big piece of the puzzle here is knowing your users. What do they most often need help with? What information are they most often accessing? What are they most often struggling with in their daily lives or in your company's product that would make them turn to the content? Because there's really no point in usability testing the content that users never actually look for, right? So that's some kind of baseline user research you need to have in order to be able to actually effectively test your content. Holistic user testing, what you might think of when people say user testing, where they're performing end-to-end tasks and they might have the product and the documentation in front of them. That usually combines the content and the document design that is used to present that content. And it can answer all of those questions. But it's also possible to target your efforts on just whether users can find the information they need by testing the organization of the content. In other words, the information architecture. So what is our information architecture? IA is the practice of grouping or arranging different pieces of information in a way that makes sense. It also includes labeling those groups and pieces of information in an intuitive and understandable way. And all of that creates a path for users to make sense of the information in front of them and find their way around your content. And you can really effectively test the IA before the team begins actually writing the content. So, many writers use an outline before they begin, right? They'll sketch out their different headings and the main points they'll be including. That outline often actually is the beginning of the IA for that content. Tree testing gives you the ability to test just that information architecture before you have any of the other pieces in place. You might not know what the final website design looks like. You might not have all the information you need for each of the sections, but you know which types of content you need to include and the subjects they need to be about. And this way, you can actually make sure that the content is organized around what makes sense to the users instead of what makes sense internally to the company. And that sounds like common sense, right? But all too often, companies don't even realize the assumptions that they are holding about the best way to organize information. Think about any corporate website you've ever been to where it's organized around the departments inside the company, but you can't find the information you need because you don't know which department is in charge of it. It happens to me anytime I try to visit my town's website. I can never find where the town dump information is because or the dog license information because it's part of some very specific department that I have no idea what the name of it is or that it even exists, right? So testing that information architecture can be a really valuable way to demonstrate to stakeholders that their mental model for organizing information is not the same as their users. So tree testing gives participants a tree that shows them your navigation hierarchy without any UI elements or other visual indicators. It's just the labels. So the results of this can give you insight into how easily users can find information in your product or documentation, how understandable your labels are, and where users go to find information that you might not have expected, which is always my favorite part of a tree test. Finding out somebody went to a completely different place than I would have thought to get that information. Most importantly, when you go to use a tree test, if you have a new type of content or documentation that you're developing, running a tree test early on in the content development process can be really insightful and allow your writers to adjust their content based on its results before the first version is even published. You can also use tree testing as a really good follow-up to card sorting. Card sorting is another method for testing information architecture. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about it here, but it's usually when you know what information you have to include, but you really don't know how to organize it. And so doing that can give you an idea of where to start with your tree. And once you have that first stab at the tree and the labels, then you can do a tree test to validate that that information architecture actually works, or find out where it doesn't and then adjust. Tree tests are also really useful for evaluating or benchmarking an existing IA. You might have anecdotal stories about a couple of problem areas, but you need evidence to actually demonstrate those problems to stakeholders, and the tree test can do that pretty easily. Or if you're already planning to make changes to the IA, but you want to benchmark the results to prove that the changes have made a positive difference for the users, you can tree test the existing IA and then later run a different tree test on the new IA. And most commonly, this happens to me a lot, we end up with different IA options and need to choose the best one. So it might be because stakeholders have differing opinions, or your card sort was split pretty evenly in a very few key areas, or just there are different opinions on the team in general about how it should be organized, right? There's never one way to organize information. So when you run a test to compare the two trees, sorry, like an A/B test, that can be really useful for determining which option works best for your users and your use cases. All right, now we can get into the fun stuff. Once you know that you want to do a tree test, how do you actually run one? So to set up a tree test, the very first thing you should be doing is building out your tree. And I've just included an example of one here. You want to make sure that you're taking the exact labels from your content headings and your website's navigation. You also want to make sure you're including the entire hierarchy for whatever you're trying to test. Even if you just have a question about one section, it can be beneficial to include all sections, because you might not realize that users actually have trouble deciding between the two different sections in the first place. And then make sure in the same way that you include all levels down to the very last level of the hierarchy, so that participants have to go as deep as they would in your navigational structure to get to the content that they need. Then you're going to write out the tasks like you would for a traditional usability test, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about how to do that in a minute. And then you have to make some decisions about whether you're going to be moderated or unmoderated. So moderated sessions allow for a lot more qualitative results. You can record the participants' thoughts that they say out loud as they're moving through the tree, and you can ask them more questions about why they chose certain items over others. And this is really useful if you have less participants, because those qualitative results can give you more information to interpret the final data. Unmoderated is great because it lets you get a lot wider of a participant base, but it usually requires some type of tree testing software like Optimal, because you need to be able to record every click that the user takes. And as far as the number of participants, because tree testing is so heavily focused on the quantitative analysis, you do need a higher number of participants to gather useful results. And you always want to make sure that they're representative of your real users, even if they aren't your actual users. Usually 20 participants is the minimum that you need for a tree test in order to get enough quantitative data that you can really accurately interpret. However, there are ways to still get useful results out of a tree test, even if you can't recruit 20 people. You can run some or even all of the sessions with a moderator, even if you have software like Optimal, and that way you can gather that extra qualitative feedback and gives you more insights into the results. The example we're going to look at later actually did not have 20 participants, and we still got a lot of really good, useful results out of it. So when you're writing tasks, there are a couple of things that you want to keep in mind. And this is kind of in general, not just for tree testing, but it's especially important with tree testing where you're just looking at labels. So you want to make sure you're using different terminology in the task than you have in the tree. So for example, if you use something like update in the tree, make sure your task talks about modifying instead, so that people aren't just looking for a word match there. Keep the tasks simple. Give just enough context that they understand what they're trying to do, but not so much context that it distracts the participants from understanding the main point of the task, because that will get them off track and they might not know what information they're trying to find. You want to make sure you choose some high priority goals to focus on or problem areas. You don't need to make sure that you have a task for every menu item. I've seen people get tripped up on that a lot, right? You'll learn what makes people select other menu items as they're going through the tasks, but you should make sure those tasks are really focused on the things you need information about. And then make sure you define all of your correct answers, especially if there are multiple, because there might be, the same information in 2 different locations. And you want to make sure that if the participant gets to one of them, it's not counted as incorrect just because it wasn't written down as the correct answer. So here's an example task just to kind of demonstrate some of these principles. So this is the scenario that we were provided to the user. You want to know how to report that product sent to Russia from another country has been approved by customs. And the goal here was to determine whether users are more successful when their first click is based on a task they need to do or the use case about why they have to do the task. And then we define the pass criteria here. So this was for an A/B test. So we had tree A and tree B. And you can see I've just listed out all the clicks the user had to take to get to the correct answer. And if they did that, that was considered a pass and a success in our end results. So a few best practices to keep in mind as you're setting up your tree tests. You usually want to keep the number of tasks to 10 or less so that you don't overwhelm the participants, even if you could, in theory, include more because tree tests are usually pretty quick. They tend to get overwhelmed if you give them too many tasks, right? Make sure that you run a pilot test to ensure that the tasks are actually understandable. And then this is really important. If you run 2 tests with 2 different trees, always make sure you have separate participant groups. So just like in A/B testing for regular usability tests, if you show the same person a second tree, they're going to be biased by their experiences with the first tree, and the results are not going to be as useful. It's really tempting to try to say, well, I want to do an A/B test, but I only have 20 participants. Can't we just show both of them both trees? And there will be stakeholders who try to push you to do that, and you want to really stand your ground and say, that's going to bias our results. We're not going to get accurate information. And then finally, make sure you ask qualitative questions at the end. Even if you're doing an unmoderated session, usually the tree testing software will allow you to put questions at the end that participants can fill out. So things like, how confident were you that you found the right places to complete the tasks? How easy or difficult was it for you to find the right places to go to complete the tasks? And do you have any other thoughts or feedback you'd like to give? I always stick that open-ended qualitative question on at the end because you never know what you're going to get with it. So obviously we're here with Optimal Workshop today, and they have a really great tree testing tool that you have seen some screenshots from in some of my slides. But tree testing can be done manually, even if you don't have access to software like Optimal. So if you have an authoring tool that already includes dropdowns for your documentation, your content, your website, then you can actually just build your tree out of nested dropdowns. That's what that tree example was from earlier. The most important thing to remember there is that when you're building your own tree, participants shouldn't be able to see all of the levels at once. They should only be able to see the children of the first level they click on, and so on, just like they would in your navigation. And since you're using your own authoring tools, this option is generally cheaper, but there can be more effort required. You do need to make sure you moderate the sessions unless you have the bandwidth to develop an entire website with buttons where they can actually make their selection and say next task and things like that, which most of us do not have the bandwidth for and do not already have built into our authoring tools. And then because of that, obviously, you're going to be spending a lot more time manually recording every click and analyzing all of those results. It's not a lot of specialty skills or anything like that. It's just time to do the tediousness of recording all of those metrics that a software would be able to automate for you. So on the other hand, if you have access to user testing software like Optimal, there's a lot less of that manual tedious effort, but it's more expensive. So it really depends on what resources you have available to you. With that, you can do unmoderated sessions. That allows you for more participants. You can send out a link to the tree test to your entire user base, just like a survey, and ask them to participate. And that gives you more quantitative data, which can lead to clearer results. And then these tools, like I said, aggregate that data for you, which then leaves you with more time for analyzing the results, thinking, figuring out what your recommendations are, that kind of thing. And you often get really nice visual representations of those results. And those are really great to add to stakeholder presentations when you're trying to convince them to implement your recommendations. So if you're running moderated sessions, you want to use the same best practices that are generally employed in all usability testing. Try to have the same moderator for all sessions so that you can reduce the number of variables that impact the participants' responses. And you should try to make sure that the moderator is not the person who developed the trees, just to make sure they can remain objective and unbiased during the sessions. Make sure you give the moderator a script to stick to, including qualitative questions that they can ask during and after each task, so that you can prompt those more qualitative responses. You know, there are a lot of participants out there who may not speak out loud if they're not prompted or asked questions, and you want to take advantage of the fact that you are taking the time to do those moderated sessions so you can get that extra qualitative feedback. And then make sure you record the sessions for reference later. If you built your own tree, you have to do this so that you can go back and record each click that the participant took. But even if you're using the tree testing software, those recordings are really useful to reference later when you're aggregating qualitative feedback, and short snippets of it might even be worth including in your stakeholder presentation, depending on, you know, what the participant said, if there was something really insightful. And ideally, you should also have a note taker listening in so that the moderator doesn't need to worry about taking notes. Even if you're recording the sessions, notes are really useful so that you can reduce your effort later when you're trying to hunt through 20 session recordings for one specific piece of information you remember hearing. So for analyzing the results, there are a lot of quantitative metrics that you should plan to log when you create your tree test. The first and simplest is the success rate. How many participants succeeded at finding the correct destination in each task? And there's directness, which is how many clicks the participant took to find the correct destination compared to the ideal number of clicks. You also want to measure time taken, which is very related to directness. So how long do they take on each task? If they have more clicks, they're probably spending more time. First clicks. So this is which option the participants clicked on first for each task. We know there's a huge drop-off rate if people make one choice and then they can't find the information that they think they need, or they don't see anything promising in front of them. So knowing what they clicked on first, especially if it's not as direct, but it is still successful, is incredibly useful. And then final destination. So which options did the participants select as their final destination for each task? Not super important if they succeeded and selected the right destination, but for cases where they didn't succeed, especially if that was kind of across the board of all your participants, where did they go? Where did they think this information was? Where were they so confident it was that that was the answer they picked without continuing to look elsewhere? So as I said, if you're using a software tool like Optimal, it's going to record each of these metrics for you, which makes it a lot easier. Do not try to record these during the session if you have a manually built tree, even as a separate observer. Just record your sessions and go back later. But you want to make sure, if you're using a manually built tree, that you have a plan for how you're going to track each of these. And then, you know, as I mentioned before, any qualitative results you gathered are going to help you interpret the quantitative results. And this is just a screenshot here of a example path from Optimal, where it showed we had really clear success rate. Nobody chose the wrong answer. They went to a couple of incorrect places and then kind of came back and found the correct answer. This is just a really clear example of one of my favorite metrics, directness. So in this situation, we had two different trees for the same content. And Optimal actually will aggregate the success rate and directness rate across all of the tasks, which is a really handy metric for that A/B tree testing. You get a very quick glance at kind of what was more successful overall. And you can see that as far as the success rate goes, both trees had almost identical successes. And I know the numbers are really small, but you can see that the green bar is pretty much the same length. There's about a 5% difference between them. So that's not going to help you very much in figuring out which one was easier for people to use. However, when you look at the directness rate, it's a lot more obvious. Tree 1's directness was 58% and tree 2's directness was 73%. So that's a really clear objective metric. While the participants were equally likely to find the information for each task, with the second tree, they got there faster and with less clicking around on the options that they were not looking for, which can be really important when you have stakeholders who really want things organized the way they want, and they see the success rate of the tree that they think makes the most sense. And they say, well, they'll be able to find it regardless. And you can point to this and say, no, but look how many more clicks it took. Look how much more time it took. So now let's look at an example of a tree test. So just some context here for you. This is an example from a couple of years ago at my previous company, TraceLink, for a new type of documentation that we were developing. So the new documentation type, it had a lot more information than we've ever included in a single help center before. So we had two different ways that we could have organized the information: by the task the user needed to perform, or by the use case, otherwise known as the reason why they were performing that task. And we set up two different trees and sourced our participants from anyone inside the company who had a working knowledge of the pharmaceutical supply chain, but didn't know anything about the Russia compliance requirements, which was the focus of this documentation. And that was really representative of the eventual users of the content, right? They work in pharmaceutical supply chain. They now have to comply with these new Russia compliance requirements. We didn't have a lot of access to actual users at my last company. We did a lot of testing with our internal users, and it still gave us a lot of very good information. At the time, we didn't have Optimal Workshop, so this was all done by hand. We used Madcap Flare, which was our authoring tool at that time, and we built the trees with that. We did decide, though, at the beginning of this project that we wanted to build an argument for getting user testing software. So we tracked the hours that everyone spent on this project as a way to demonstrate the amount of work it took to actually do something like this by hand, and then compare it to the estimates of how long it would have taken if we had had something like Optimal. And we did ultimately make our case that we should get Optimal licenses, and we managed to get a couple. That gave us the opportunity to run a lot more tree tests in much less time after this. So we had 9 participants for each tree, which you'll obviously see is much lower than what I said was the recommended amount. We ran every session with a moderator so that we could gather all of the qualitative feedback we could. And in the end, the qualitative feedback turned out to be a lot more valuable than the quantitative feedback, since we had that lower number of participants. But it still gave us so much information we could use to improve our labeling and the placement of certain tasks. And it did still definitively tell us that the tree organized by use case was actually easier for our users to understand. And the great thing about this is, since it was for the documentation, we were able to implement the changes before the writers actually began working on the content, which caused a lot less churn for them, and it led to a better document that we were finally able to publish as an initial version. So this is the same example task from earlier. You want to know how to report that product sent to Russia from another country has been approved by customs. And then we have tree 1 and tree 2 here. So you can see how we set them up as nested dropdowns in the Madcap Flare output. And users basically clicked and expanded on each one and saw the children, and then continued down into the nested dropdowns as they needed to. When they found the final topic that they would go to, they would tell the moderator something like, I'd find it here. If they didn't say that specifically, the moderator had instructions to confirm that they were actively choosing a specific option. And then once that task was done, the moderator would take over the screen, refresh the page, and they would start again with a fully collapsed tree. And you can see that for these two trees, they have pretty much the same number of levels of the hierarchy. The labels are pretty similar, but the order in which they're nested is very different, which can make a big difference for users when they're trying to find something. And that was the primary thing we were trying to test, was which order should we nest these pieces of information in, because we had so much of it. So this is just a few results that we presented to our stakeholders. It was actually the first usability test that we had run on the information architecture for our help centers and documentation. So these findings actually ended up informing a lot of our documentation and content strategy going forward, which is really interesting. One thing we didn't expect was that when participants were looking for the answer to a problem, they specifically looked for the word troubleshooting. Even though historically, under troubleshooting, all we had done was list the error messages and descriptions of them. But they really wanted a troubleshooting section that told them how to fix their problem. So in the end, we actually ended up having a section in all of our help centers that said troubleshoot a problem to make sure that users could find an answer, and proactively tried to add situations to that to help them. And that was, setting it up that way rather than nesting that information into each topic like we had originally intended. We also discovered that participants considered setting up the master data about their companies, partners, and products as part of configuring the system. And this is actually a great example of the difference between how a company looks at things internally and how our users looked at it. We had this separated out because that was how it was set up in our system. Configuring the system was different from adding this master data information. But because of this result, we moved the master data information into the configure TraceLink section, which did already exist. It just didn't have that those tasks in there. And then we also discovered that participants expected all of the information about each report, which the system would send out to the government on their behalf, to be located in one place. So they wanted to see the prerequisites for the report to trigger, the UI task, the API documentation, information about the report itself, everything to do with that. They wanted it in one singular place. We had it split out a little bit before that. And so we brought them all together so that when they were looking for specifically this declare customs report, they could see everything they needed that had to do with that report. So that's pretty much it. Happy to take any questions that you all have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation. Very informative. We have had a question pop up, so I'll just jump right into it. Do you regard it as a pass only if users follow the journey you had in mind, or do you also have alternative ways by which the user can get to the target destination?
That's a great question. So that was when I was saying you want to make sure you define all of the correct answers. Make sure you know where those alternate paths are and define them as correct answers up front. Obviously, if you realize you missed a correct answer later on, you can go back and adjust your pass criteria and make sure that you're counting people who went to that area. But it's a lot easier if you can have that upfront defined with, there might be 3 different places that are technically passes because they found the right information in different places. And you want to have that upfront as much as you can.
Yeah, makes sense. Because I feel like so many, especially government websites and things like that, definitely have information in multiple places. Do you then have like a ranking system for if the person, like if one route was faster than another? So they would all technically be passes, but then you would have a ranking system of perhaps, well, this one was the best one because it was the fastest, or
the most direct,
yeah, or are you looking at different criteria that maybe directness isn't your main objective?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't had that situation before.
Okay.
Mostly because I don't work for government agencies, so usually my general principle is if you're going to repeat information, have it pointing back to a singular place. So I haven't had to test that, but I feel like that would be a good goal for a task or a couple of tasks where you have repeated information. The goal might be, we want to see which way users are typically getting to this information. And then at that point, if it's split, you could kind of look at directness and why they went from the qualitative data, that kind of thing. But that would be a really interesting test for sure.
Thank you. The next question we have up is, how do you treat results that demonstrated the users were used to do something based on an existing system versus what is ideal? Oh, that's interesting.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, of course. So how do you treat results that demonstrate that participants or users were used to doing something? So like traditionally they've gone to this website maybe 100 times. They know that the information is in this one area, even though it's not the best place for that information. How do you kind of treat those results of a existing system versus you're trying to build something new and better? Yeah.
Yep. That's a really good question. I think it depends on the situation. If you're trying to benchmark your existing IA and prove that it has issues, you want to find new users. You
Yeah.
want to be able to show how difficult it is to learn those things versus testing with users who have already kind of memorized the way you do it because they just had to because they use it every day, right? I found new users, or if you're using internal folks, new employees and support or services, that kind of thing can be really useful in kind of proving that out with a benchmark test. If you're doing a newer IA and you want people to kind of put aside all their preconceived notions, that's where the moderator script comes in, or if you're doing unmoderated sessions, the introduction. But it's for unmoderated, it's a little bit harder because you can't force people to read that and not just click through it. So I would probably recommend doing moderated sessions if you know this is an issue for a new IA. But what we've done in the past, because at my last company, we had this issue as well, was we made sure in the moderator script, we stressed really hard and repeated a couple of times. We want you to set aside all of your preconceived notions about the way the system works today. This is about doing it brand new. How could we better organize this system? And specifically, I think we had done it for a card sort and a tree test, and basically really wanted to hammer that home to folks. And we had pretty good success with that. Again, with moderated sessions where we were able to very personally make sure they understood that that's what we wanted to get out of it.
Yeah. Another thing that Optimal can provide is those pre-screener questions. And so you could do a
Yep.
screening question that kind of said, have you used this site before? And if they say yes, then they're excluded from continuing on with the test. That way you do get that kind of fresh set of eyes. But no, very
Yeah.
good question. Thank you so much, Jasmine. Our next question is, in terms of qualitative data, how big would you want the user sample to be, or how do you determine what is a good sample for your specific project?
That's a good question. I tend to fall back on the minimum number that Nielsen Norman recommends for full-blown usability testing, which is usually like between 5 and 6, and any more than 10, you're probably going to hear the same things over and over again. So, in other usability, in other tree tests where we have done moderated and unmoderated, we have usually set a goal for between like 6 and 10 moderated sessions per tree, and then as many unmoderated as we could get. That's generally what I've done in the past that has had a lot of success.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll give it a few more minutes to see if any other questions kind of pop up. I've got one that had to do with your previous place of work. When you were, so it was a shipping company, is that right?
It was actually a software company that made pharmaceutical supply chain tracking software. So it tracked shipments
There we go.
of pharma supply chain.
Thank you. How when you're dealing with what I assume to be like a vast amount of information, because you're dealing with multiple countries and their own kind of like regulations, you kind of talked about how you do the tree test, but what kind of work is involved in kind of organizing your information to do the actual tree test? I feel like I would be quite overwhelmed in that situation with all the different custom regulations and drug import rules and all of that. Where do you even kind of begin for something like that?
Yeah, so that was why we went through the effort of doing all of this in a manual way for that specific set of documentation. We had compliance regulations before that we had to document, but Russia specifically was so vast and complicated that we couldn't organize it the way that we had been. It just didn't scale.
Yeah.
And so at that point, it was more of a, we used our SMEs who knew Russia compliance and who knew pharma supply chain, and we used our own kind of content strategy backgrounds and came up with our best guesses at what would be useful. And we found that a lot of it wasn't useful, but then that feedback from the tree test let us make it better and make it more useful.
Thank you for that. We've had another question pop up, but I'm think I'm having a little trouble understanding it, so I might offer the person the opportunity if they'd like to raise their hand. It's from Marina, but I'll read it as it stands. Why Tree 2 was less success, although it has more directness? Do you know which one she's referring to?
I think she's referring to the directness example that I had brought up in the beginning. This one? Yeah, this one, I think.
Oh, okay. So yeah, yes,
Yes. Okay.
verified. Yeah.
Um, it's a fair question. Um, I don't actually remember. This is not from the same example I used later on, obviously, because this is from Optimal. I don't remember the specifics of why this in particular had a slightly lower success rate with higher directness. I think there was one particular task that might have knocked down the success rate a little bit. But overall, between all of the tasks, it was a lot more direct. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, we took that information about like what was the specific task they were struggling with in tree 2, and we made some adjustments to those labels in tree 2. We didn't just take tree 2. That's the other thing when you're doing this, right? You can take a look at tree 1 and tree 2 and see what was successful and what wasn't in each of them, and you might end up with a third example of we combined what was successful about both, and now we have this, mostly pretty usable tree test.
Yeah. So does that mean that you're often running a quite iterative process with your tree test? So you might realize that one branch is quite successful, but you need to tinker with another one. Do you then retest everything all together, or do you just kind of test that one branch?
I think ideally we would retest everything all together. We didn't have the resources and time for that, unfortunately. But we basically would take those results and then take the tree and bring it to our SMEs and make sure that there was not something we had done that was completely out of the realm of possibility, or not usable or not understandable from a user perspective, which usually we didn't, because we could see what was not understandable or not usable, right? Because a lot of times it can be like, you might have categories 1 through 5, and you find that 4 and 5 are what really confuse people in one tree. And then in the other tree, the way you organized it, it made perfect sense, but categories 1, 2, 3 didn't make sense, right? And so sometimes it's just a matter of like taking this piece and that piece, and you can be pretty confident that when you put them together, because they're mostly unrelated, that it'll work. I think that's what happened in this situation.
Yeah, fair. I'll give one more final call for questions. But in the meantime, I just wanted to say thank you again so much for taking the time to present with us today, to share your insights. And I really commend you on doing a lot of this work manually in the beginning, because I've seen how elaborate some of these tree tests can be and the amount of work that goes into actually um, presenting those findings and organizing everything in a manual way. It was just truly commendable. So you and your team did some serious work, which is crazy. We've
Yeah, thank you.
got one final
Appreciate being
question.
here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one final question has popped up, and then I'll hand it over to you to wrap up and say any last words. Um, Thinking about internal instances, what do you find most impactful to influence internal stakeholders to understand the importance of user-friendly language?
So what's most important about basically convincing stakeholders?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Usability testing. It's really, really hard for them to continue advocating for language that's not user friendly when you test that non-user friendly language and it comes back as not understandable, or it comes back as a significant problem in the usability testing. So tree testing can be really good for that, right? Because you're just focusing on the labels. If the terminology that you're trying to advocate for changing is in the navigation. If it's beyond the navigation, that I find is usually best mitigated with a lot of user research. If you can talk to real users, find out what words they use in their day-to-day lives, and then also compare that with what words do your competitors use for the same concepts. And sometimes you can find competitors who are using that user-friendly language. And when you put that in front of your stakeholders who respect those competitors or want to beat those competitors, then you can say, well, we should be doing it because it's working over there. And that can be very persuasive as well.
Another option with that, just to highlight, is in some of the card sorting, you can, I know we're talking about tree testing, but in card sorting, you can have where you can type in your own labels. And so you might see a
Yes.
natural organic pattern of people typing in that more plain language of what they would prefer to see, how things are organized or categorized, which could also validate that kind of user-friendly language that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Leah, any last words to wrap anything up?
I don't think so. I think the only thing I'll say is that I would love to see more content teams advocating for doing their own user testing if they can manage to squeeze it into their time, because it can be super valuable for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to present. Thank you to everyone for joining us for UX Insider. The list of resources is still in the chat, so please feel free to click and copy those links. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.